In the depths of the Azerbaijani mountains, along one of the many tributaries of the Alazani River, on the border with Georgia, an unprecedented natural event occurred in 1981. The last recorded instance, dating back to approximately the 10th century CE, saw the region suffer a sudden drop in the water levels of rivers, lakes, and natural reservoirs, sparking a severe water crisis in the country. This phenomenon, for which science has yet to find an explanation, has been identified as part of a cycle that occurs every 800 to 900 years. Ancient texts from around 200 CE speak of severe crises related to the sudden drop in river levels, which made it nearly impossible to obtain water. When this event reoccurred in the 1980s, a group of Russian and Azerbaijani geologists and archaeologists became deeply intrigued by a phenomenon they had long hoped to one day confirm. Having monitored several of the region's rivers since the 1970s, they finally witnessed the emergence of the phenomenon. This provided invaluable information for studying the movement of water masses between the Caspian Sea and the Caucasus Mountains. After long days of work under the scorching heat of the Azerbaijani summer, a few miles north of the city of Mahamalar, the experts discovered areas that had never been mapped before. In that place, the receding waters revealed a complex network of cavernous entrances, as well as invaluable sediment marks. These marks were crucial in advancing the understanding of the geological history of the Caucasus Mountains. Despite the excitement surrounding the study of these newly uncovered and unexplored areas, what drew considerable attention and some concern were the more than 20 cave entrances they found. According to the brief few days they had for exploration before the waters rose again, these entrances seemed to lead down extensive underground passages. The discoveries were both impressive and wholly unexpected. Rock paintings abounded in most of the caves. Many depicted large gatherings of men surrounding enormous figures towering among them. The experts who meticulously photographed each painting could hardly believe what they had found. Up until that point, no records indicated human activity in the region from such an ancient time. In fact, in 1989, after studying the material and sediments collected from the caves, they dated the alterations to the stones, along with the paintings, to around 80,000 BCE, almost twice as old as the oldest known cave paintings found up until then. One of the strangest surprises, even more startling than the dating of the paintings, was a curious golden throne, seemingly embedded into the rock.
The Caucasus Mountains, stretching majestically from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea, represent one of the world's most prominent mountain borders, serving as a natural bridge between Europe and Asia. In Georgia, this mountain range not only shapes the physical landscape, but has also profoundly influenced the country's history and culture. Composed of the Greater Caucasus to the north and the Lesser Caucasus to the south, this formidable geographical barrier has acted both as a protective shield and a persistent challenge for the civilizations that have inhabited the region. The Greater Caucasus, defining much of Georgia's northern frontier, is dominated by peaks like Mount Kazbek, a sacred mountain rising 5,033 meters above sea level. Throughout history, these mountains have provided a safe haven against external invasions, enabling Georgia to preserve and cultivate its cultural identity. However, their strategic position has also made the region a vital corridor for trade and migration, attracting a multitude of empires, from the Persians to the Mongols, each of which has left an indelible mark on the history of the Western world. As is often the case in regions overshadowed by vast natural landscapes, unexplained events frequently haunt their inhabitants, while others remain hidden, waiting for someone to discover them someday. The story that brings us together today has its roots deep within the Racha Lakhumi and Kwemosvaneti Park, located in the northern regions of Georgia. Though this area is currently embroiled in political and territorial disputes, the mysteries that loom over its towering mountains trace back to a history far removed from the present. In what is now known as Oni, one of the last towns on Georgia's northern route toward the Caucasus Mountains, a series of passageways was discovered during the Soviet era, specifically in 1965, beneath the Central Synagogue. These passageways led to an ancient library dating back at least to the 15th century, where nearly 230 books were found, though only about 20 were in readable condition. The rest had been ravaged by mold, or the ink had simply faded away between the pages. Among the recovered texts was a note dated 1442, written by an Orthodox priest. It was found tucked between the pages of a history book from that period, explicitly referencing the presence of demonic entities that had plagued a village called Ostriasi, located nearly 6 miles north of the Oni synagogue. The note, signed by the priest, appeared to be intended for a nobleman whom he advised against conducting any expeditions in the area. The village of Ostriasi had been founded just 10 years before the letter was written. It started as a strategic military outpost in the mountains in response to the threat posed by the Timurid invasions. In fact, after the sacking of the capital by Tamerlane, many inhabitants of the Kingdom of Georgia ended up settling on the mountain slopes. What the mountain dwellers didn't anticipate was that, in the years leading up to the Mongol invasion of the Caucasus, Sultan Muhammad II of the Chagatai Khanate, known for his dark practices that ultimately led to the downfall of his empire, had sent an entourage of men to study the region. This mission provided successive Mongol rulers with privileged information about the supposedly hidden settlements in the mountains nearly a century later. It is said, and this is corroborated by the contents of the priest's letter, that Sultan Muhammad II sent his entourage to curse the mountains. Archaeological excavations carried out in 1998 revealed peculiar monoliths buried beneath some structures that have stood since the 15th century. The priest was adamant in his letter, stressing that anyone who settled in Ostriasi eventually succumbed to an incomprehensible madness. On a mission to evangelize the village, he witnessed the condition of its inhabitants firsthand. He described the buildings as being in a terrible state, houses with blackened wood, gnawed upon by the very people living in them. From the few villagers he managed to speak with, he recalled a phrase that seemed to be repeated constantly: "Shikorek's eyes burn my skin." The approximately 110 residents of Ostriasi appeared to have lost their sanity and sense of self. Some wandered aimlessly through the streets, dragging their feet and staring blankly at the sky. Others remained locked in their homes, desperately trying to relieve a strange pain beneath their skin. In the letter, the priest insisted that no one should approach the village. He wrote that not even God had a place there, and that staying for more than 2 days led to horrific visions and thoughts. Additionally, he noted how, by the second day, the sunlight seemed much more intense, despite the otherwise mild weather at that time of year. "There is a cursed presence that even blessed relics cannot repel. My lord, I implore you to urge your people to abandon the surrounding area and forbid the ascent up the mountain toward Astriasi. The people there are dangerous, and our faith seems to hold no power." With these words, the priest concluded his letter. Certainly, what was written in the letter does not constitute definitive proof of what may have truly happened in those mountains over 600 years ago. The difficult terrain, Georgia's relative poverty, and the constant historical struggles among various peoples claiming the territory make it challenging to even contemplate comprehensive studies on those villages. However, over time, and with the advent of new sources of information available to the contemporary world, materials have surfaced that could potentially reveal strange secrets in the Caucasus. To explore this, we must go back to a much more recent date, 1960. At that time, the country was known as the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic. With the technological advancements that the vast eastern nation had provided to its smaller satellite states, new cities emerged, and the need to turn every territory into a source of material wealth became paramount. While Georgian scientists excelled in fields such as mathematics, mechanics, astrophysics, and physiology, it was also necessary to transform the country into a producer and extractor of raw materials. In this context, the potential for mining in the Caucasus Mountains became a significant economic incentive for the Soviet Union. Areas that can still be found on various maps today, most now reduced to a few streets, country houses, or summer retreats, were once thriving settlements dedicated to mining, logging, and weapons testing between the 1930s and the 1960s. However, starting in 1965, these settlements began to decline at an alarming rate. Although the collapse of the Soviet Union was still a distant prospect, something in the Caucasus Mountains was causing hundreds of people to return to their homes, while others simply vanished without a trace. Since news from Georgia, like in most Soviet satellite states, was of little interest to internal politics, this case received only local journalistic coverage. Any broader investigation was strongly suppressed by the Kremlin due to repeated attempts to report the region's labor conditions to foreign media. At the time, it became known that the miners had accused the authorities of ignoring their demands for improved ventilation. In 1962, a group of 6 miners reported being poisoned by a reddish substance that began seeping from the deposits. Contact with the gas caused them severe eye injuries and behavioral changes, culminating in the tragic Gebi massacre, where 20 miners were abducted under mysterious circumstances by their own colleagues. Nearly a week later, they were found half buried deep within the mine, with strange symbols carved into their arms and burned into their foreheads with a heated blade. This was undoubtedly the most notorious case, and the one most effectively silenced by the Moscow authorities. However, around the same time, many families who had moved to the mountains began to complain that their homes appeared to have been built on extremely unstable ground. Some reported foul-smelling liquids seeping up from the floors, while others mentioned strange black substances oozing between the wooden planks. Naturally, certain diseases, unknown at the time, began to spread as provisions were increasingly contaminated by poisoned water and even tainted soil. Although several specialists were dispatched from the capital, including geologists, chemists, and doctors, the results of their studies seemed to lead nowhere. The central government feared that news of Georgian workers being poisoned at their job sites might spread to the rest of the satellite states. However, the investigators reported that nothing in the area seemed to function as it should. In this case, function extended even to the natural laws themselves. In both the villages, and especially in the mines, a substance with characteristics difficult to classify by the chemistry of the time was seeping through every crack in the earth as well as into its depths. The substance wasn't flammable, yet it caused irritating effects similar to those of materials that reacted violently to fire. Additionally, prolonged exposure to it led to drastic behavioral changes, driving victims to commit horrific acts. However, the substance itself was extraordinarily challenging to study. In fact, no examination could be conducted in properly equipped laboratories. The substance only remained stable when stored in one of the mountain cities. Inside the mines, the situation was even more perplexing. The deeper one dug, the further into the mountains one ventured, the denser this substance became, to the point where newly excavated spaces would end up flooded with this light gas, which, upon accumulation, took on a liquid form. This inundation was immensely toxic, making it impossible to continue without facing dreadful consequences. Not even specialized equipment could adequately protect workers from the severe burns caused by the gas, both externally and internally. After the abandonment of the cities, Georgia plunged into a deep economic crisis. Moscow severely punished this apparent defiance of labor mandates, and the Georgian state suffered serious sanctions. In fact, this marked the beginning of the major crisis that would culminate in the dissolution of the Eurasian nation in the 1990s. As the new millennium approached and with the arrival of independence, some curious individuals ventured into the ghost towns that dotted the Caucasus Mountains, discovering buildings and scientific facilities in complete abandonment. However, since access was largely restricted during the first 15 years following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, practically no one who had visited these sites suffered any physical consequences. Over the years, the story of these cities gradually faded into deep obscurity. Today, there are not even urban explorers who venture into the mountains, primarily because they are unaware of the ruins of once significant labor settlements. For the rural inhabitants of the villages near the mountains, legends persist that have been passed down through generations, even long before the Soviet crisis. The Caucasus Mountains continue to await those curious enough to unravel a mystery that seems to stretch back further than we might imagine.
if you've ever come across that photograph online, you might have thought it was a hoax or perhaps a scene from a 1970s movie. But the truth is far more unsettling, and this photographic record provides compelling evidence that explains the strange events that unfolded in Georgia, north of its capital, Tbilisi, between 1976 and 1979. In fact, that very photograph played a crucial role in the 1980s, sparking the largest crackdown in the history of the Eurasian country against the dismantling of a cult. This is the story of the cult of the Sun King, or as it was more popularly known at the time, the followers of the true king in yellow. The events of this story took place entirely in the village of Akmeta, about 30 miles north of the Georgian capital. At that time, the country was still part of the Soviet Union's satellite states, with all cultural, educational, economic, and labor activities tightly controlled by the government offices in Moscow. However, due to Georgia's complex terrain, its underdevelopment in the 20th century, and its small geographic size, many law enforcement agents struggled to maintain control beyond the major cities and the port hubs on the Black and Caspian Seas from Azerbaijan. This peculiar story is known to have its origins in an ancient iconography found in one of the many coal mines near Akmeta in the Caucasus Mountains. It is said that the miners were so struck and awed by the image's immaculate craftsmanship, as well as the perfect golden trim outlining its contours, that they decided to carefully extract it from the mountain's depths. Some accounts suggest that it took nearly 3 weeks to fully extract the figure, given the extreme care required and the need to directly modify the mine tunnels to bring the piece out intact. Naturally, mining operations were disrupted during those weeks, but no one reported these irregularities. The mere sight of the golden figure sparked an unusual fascination, causing everyone to abandon any other activity. Once the figure was removed from the mine, it was taken to the administrative office in the center of Akmeta. There, both men and women began to suffer from what we would now call hallucinations. These visions reportedly depicted fantasies of success, a perfect life, and an eternity tailored to individual desires. It could even be said that the figure represented an idealized version of paradise for those who gazed upon it directly. In 1976, the first men who discovered the figure deep within the mine decided to keep its existence a secret. Although many had already seen it, they resolved to place it on an improvised altar in one of the rooms of the administrative office. Tensions are believed to have arisen between those who wanted to keep the figure almost hidden, to prevent outsiders, skeptics who might doubt the marvel they had found, or those who might try to steal it, from knowing about it, and those who wished to reveal it to the world. However, by the end of the year, Moscow agents, alerted to the significant decline and irregularities in coal extraction in the area, decided to visit the village of Akmeta personally. Armed with a supreme order for potential intervention in the region and prosecution of those responsible, 5 agents met with the village's captain and administrator in the central office. There, as noted in their reports, they failed to obtain any seemingly logical answers. It is possible that some of the miners, including the captain, may have contracted a neurological disease during their excavation activities. Zurab Yorbanadze, the head of operations in Zone 4 of the Northern District, has submitted an irregular report concerning the constant work stoppages. We suspect that the man has suffered some form of brain trauma, which has impaired his ability to perform his duties as expected. This is the only existing record before the events that sparked the Great Catastrophe in Akmeta. It is suspected that after a less than thorough investigation of the office, the Moscow agents discovered the figure in one of the rooms, hidden behind a false door in one of the basement walls. Speculation suggests that the agents fell under the figure's spell, which had apparently taken on a slightly different form with the arrival of winter and had begun to merge with the walls. After that event, the followers of what had now become known as the figure in yellow came to realize that anyone who confronted the sacred image would inevitably fall before its power and message. Thus, there was no longer any reason to keep it hidden. Consequently, all mining operations were completely halted, at least according to the orders from Moscow regarding labor and economic planning. Gradually, the administrative office was transformed into a temple dedicated to the mysterious figure. But to understand the peculiar power of the figure in yellow, it is necessary to go back to the 12th century, known in history as the Golden Age of Georgia. It is well documented that David IV, also known as David the Builder, who ascended to the throne in the year 1089, led the liberation of the capital Tbilisi from Seljuk Turkish control. Under his leadership, the Kingdom of Georgia became a strong, centralized state. However, what is less discussed is that David IV achieved a feat that, by all accounts, seemed impossible. Both the military strategy and the disparity in numbers made this endeavor appear doomed from the start. There are texts, possibly disputed by the official versions of Georgian history, that speak of David's staff, a relic that the king carried instead of a sword. This staff, entirely gilded, bore the sculpted head of a deity with an empty expression, a deity completely unknown. Even the texts that address this subject cannot definitively conclude the origin of this relic. However, what is recorded with some precision relates to the power this staff granted the king. David IV stood magnanimous before the impure and the enemies of Georgian blood. The yellow staff carried an inhuman force, almost beyond the limits of nature and the stars. A power directly divine would devastate anyone who locked eyes with the empty gaze of the face on the staff. The king himself led impossible battles, dismounting his horse and marching against the enemy. His confidence lay in his staff, which rendered him immune to any attack. When King David IV died in 1125, it is said that he ordered, before his death, that his remains be buried in the Caucasus Mountains in a golden coffin, along with his staff, and that his tomb be bathed in liquid gold before it was sealed. His granddaughter, Queen Tamar, who succeeded him on the throne of the Kingdom of Georgia, regarded this ritual as of immense importance to the fate of her people. As a result, she decided that the exact location of her grandfather's tomb would remain a secret. No one was to possess the staff after his deeds, for it was truly a dangerous object. Given this background, there is a strong possibility that the figure discovered by the Akmeta miners was the gold-covered body of King David IV, which had fused with his staff, transforming him into an object of incalculable power. The nature of the power that resided in the staff may have evolved over the centuries. For the following year, in 1977, nearly 40% of the permanent population of the town of Akmeta had, in one way or another, fallen under the spell of the figure in yellow. In a society that, despite Soviet imposition, had rejected Catholicism, there still existed in certain rural areas an unquestionable loyalty to the Orthodox Church. However, in this town, beliefs slowly began to shift drastically. With such a profound change in the townspeople, several internal conflicts arose. Some argued about the false god and the false messiah that were being worshipped. For nearly 5 months, there was an effort to dismantle the town's only church. During that time, they even had to combat an attempted arson, which resulted in significant structural damage and the deaths of 3 priests. Some men, particularly those who were the first to come into contact with the figure in yellow, began to frequent the church's exterior and patrol the town's streets. The intimidation tactics had some positive effects on their cause, while others tried to convince those who had never seen the figure in yellow to take a trip to the administrative office, where it was still being kept. It was during the summer of that year that the parish priest was kidnapped and forced to kneel before the figure in yellow. From that day on, all religious centers began to be stripped of any Catholic imagery. And although the conversion of the main ecclesiastical authorities led more people to fall under the spell of the strange figure, the church itself was not used as a place of worship for the figure in yellow. Its followers believed that such places should be burned and wiped off the map. And just as they had planned, they dismantled the entire church and burned its foundations. In its place, residential buildings were constructed, erasing all traces of what had once stood there. Meanwhile, the figure in yellow was moved to the outskirts of the town, to the home of one of the individuals who had initiated the downfall of this strange sect that was beginning to take shape. When analyzing everything that had transpired up to that point, certain questions arise, particularly regarding daily life in Akmeta. Despite the deep psychological impact the figure had on people, they were still able to live relatively normal lives. They continued working regularly, studying, cooking, and interacting with one another. But in all these activities, there was always some reference to the wonders the figure revealed in their minds. Medea Chenkali, a teacher from a school in Akmeta who managed to escape before the catastrophe that began the following year, gave a particularly intriguing testimony about the influence the figure in yellow had on the townspeople. In my work, I could hear my youngest students constantly talking about the figure in yellow. At first, I thought it might be some sort of game, though it already struck me as odd. During recess, these kids would gather around a drawing in the dirt and either stay silent or mumble to themselves as if they were performing a ritual. When I had to speak with some of the parents, I noticed they no longer used the typical religious expressions the older generation would often say. Now, they seemed to put their faith in the color yellow. Literally, they would talk about how that color could solve any problem. I also noticed that some appeared to have self-inflicted bruises on their arms and legs, which they covered with some sort of yellow paint. Over time, I began to see a growing aggressiveness in many of the parents. At the same time, their speech and mannerisms became more erratic. It seemed that the deeper they dove into the belief in this yellow being, the more foolish they became, to the point where they resembled animals more than humans. Lavan, as he called himself, though his real name was never known, became one of the most prominent figures in Akmeta's society. Almost like a political leader, this man, presumed to be around 50 years old and always dressed in a yellow tunic with a hood covering his head, moved the figure in yellow to his own home. There, he began delivering long lectures about the revelations the figure had bestowed upon him. While one might assume Lavan was just a charlatan, the few who remember him can attest that every one of his predictions came true with a somewhat terrifying accuracy. In fact, it was this precision that initially led many of Akmeta's residents to shift their belief more toward this man than toward the figure in yellow. And thus the unraveling of this strange phenomenon began. Lavan, a rather peculiar man, went from being somewhat of a pariah, wandering through streets and parks, gathering branches and wood to heat his small house in Akmeta, to becoming as significant as the figure in yellow itself. It is said that the first time this man encountered the figure, he felt as though it spoke to him, revealing secrets right before his eyes that no one else knew. He even claimed to see the fate of those who passed by him. Rumor has it Lavan touched the figure in yellow and stole a small golden pebble, taking with him a piece of its mystical power. Shrewdly, Lavan turned this newfound power into an unexpected source of income. People, eager to learn the future of their plans, decisions, and businesses, showered him with gifts, and in no time, he became the wealthiest and most influential man in town. By 1978, there was no one who didn't know his name or hadn't heard his words. In the midst of the fervor, a large number of townspeople decided to bring the figure to Lavan's house. There, always fearful that someday things might stop going so well for him, Lavan chose to dig a massive hole in the middle of his living room. With the help of a pulley system, he lowered the figure in yellow to a depth of about 3 meters. At the same time, he commissioned the construction of a replica of the figure with artistic touches, which he hung from the ceiling of the living room to symbolize the ever-watchful eyes of the figure in yellow. Throughout that year, no one found Lavan's decision strange or controversial. On the contrary, they saw in him the very choice of the mystical force itself, viewing him as its messenger. Curiously enough, the figure in yellow began to fade into the background, though this might be debated by those who consider the following events to be the perfect will of the golden face carved in stone. By the end of 1978, during one of the harshest winters ever recorded in Georgia, a figure as mysterious as Lavan himself emerged from among his own followers to challenge a number of things. This man, who called himself Orion, claimed to have been a coal miner since childhood. In his speeches, he accused Lavan of desecrating the true message of the figure in yellow and bringing nothing but chaos to the town. At this point, it's worth noting some important details. According to available information, Orion's complaints centered on the terrible state the town had fallen into. By then, the population had reverted to a primitive way of life. Something in the influence of the figure in yellow had altered the cognitive abilities of men, women, and children, turning them into almost savage beings in the way they acted and made decisions. Many of the houses were in serious danger of collapsing. Some people were even destroying their own homes to bring the materials as offerings to the grand sculpture at Lavan's house. Most had abandoned personal hygiene, and the effects of paranoid states were evident in the frequent street brawls over worthless objects. Orion seemed to be one of the few, if not the only one, who, while maintaining blind faith in the figure in yellow, kept his sanity relatively intact. He claimed to have been the first to truly encounter the deity in the depths of the mines. About 10 years earlier, while patrolling the tunnels, the face of the deity had appeared to him on one of the walls, assigning him the mission to eliminate the great man who would come to destroy the lands of the Caucasus. Naturally, this account was taken as a serious threat to the great order led by Lavan. During what is known as the January 79 massacre, Orion was judged at the sculpture's residence, and, as a symbolic punishment, thrown into the well where the figure in yellow lay. Following this, what some scholars of the case have termed the final phase of the conversion occurred, during which each inhabitant turned against the others, resulting in the deaths of approximately 715 people around the house, including Lavan himself. Considering that the figure in yellow may have been part of the relic with which King David IV of Georgia liberated his lands in the Middle Ages, it makes sense to think that the great catastrophe in Akmeta might have resulted from the inability to manage such power. Since information about the king's scepter is quite scarce, it remains unclear how it could have concentrated all that power into a single object without causing certain effects of madness. Although little is said about the Akmeta event, and due to its strange characteristics, it has even been relegated to the status of a creepypasta, evidence does exist and has been recovered by notable Georgian institutions. In the years following the January 1979 events, visitors to Lavan's house found no trace of the figure in yellow, except for the hole in the living room and the sculpture. It is likely that one of the survivors took the figure with them and hid it somewhere, waiting to be discovered at some point in history.